Hello, and welcome to Business Ethics, Chapter 4, The Corporate Culture Impacts and Implications. Corporate culture, which we will define shortly as the way we do things around here, in more colloquial terms, is a very, very important, vital concept to understand, because the way companies behave towards their employees and to their constituents, to their customers, and to the environment and stakeholders outside of the organization depends heavily on how they do things internally. That will be the discussion of tonight's lecture. Chapter objectives. After reading this chapter, you'll be able to define corporate culture, explain how corporate culture impacts ethical decision making, discuss the difference between a compliance-based culture and a values-based culture, discuss the role of corporate leadership in establishing the culture, explain the difference between effective leaders and ethical leaders, discuss the role of mission statements and codes in creating an ethical corporate culture, explain how various reporting mechanisms such as ethics hotlines and ombudspersons can help integrate ethics within a firm, discuss the role of assessing, monitoring, and auditing the culture and ethics program, and finally, explain how culture can be enforced via governmental regulation. Ethics and corporate culture, a quote by His Tang Chi Tsang, renowned Zen master. Although gold dust is precious, when it gets in your eyes, it obstructs your vision. What is corporate culture? Next slide. The ethical decision-making model emphasizes the individual responsibility for the decisions, but personal decision-making does not exist in a vacuum. Decision-making within a firm is influenced, limited, shaped, and sometimes determined by the corporate culture. This chapter explores some of the major issues surrounding the development, influence, and management of a corporate culture, as well as the role of business leaders in creating, enhancing, and preserving cultures that support ethical behavior. It's very important to nurture a culture that supports that behavior, because if people are corrupt and evil, it's very difficult to be good in that kind of environment. Even in this age of decentralized corporations, there remains a sense of culture in organizations. This is especially true in small local firms, but just as true of a major global corporation. Corporate culture defined is a shared pattern of beliefs, expectations, and meanings that influences and guides the thinking and behaviors of the member or the members of a particular group of employees, individuals. You can look at the next slide, which has figure 4.1, which has culture and the things that shape culture and the members of the culture. While culture shapes the people who are members of the organization, it's also shaped by the people who make up the organization. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. The culture and the members of the culture shape each other. What is corporate culture? Gert Hofstede organized national cultures into 6 dimensions. Power distance between individuals at different levels of a hierarchy, more equal and low, which equals low power distance. In other words, the feeling of superiority between top and bottom is that power distance. Individualism versus collectivism, which is the degree to which people prefer to act individually or in groups. Uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which people are comfortable with uncertainty, ambiguity, change, and risks. Time and order orientation, a high long-term orientation, which is known as LTO, is comfortable with commitments, traditions, and rewards. Masculinity versus femininity. Low masculinity indicates greater equality, strong relationships, service, and solidarity, while high masculinity suggests assertiveness and competition. Indulgent versus restrained, the extent to which people try to control their desires and impulses. Hofstede's national cultural categories. Critics say his divisions are based on generalizations and stereotypes. National culture does not explain all differences. His work focused in a single period of time and place. His perspective is biased by Western views. Only a limited number of countries were included. Supporters say he validated his country scores across over 400 different measures, so it's really wholesome and robust. His results have been repeated or replicated many times, and therefore all the objections fall away. Just as there are national cultures, next slide, businesses also have unspoken yet influential standards and expectations. If you join a firm with a culture that supports values you are uncomfortable with, there will be conflicts and you won't be able to perform well. No culture is static, cultures change, but modifying culture is a bit like moving an iceberg. The iceberg is always moving, and if ignored, will continue to float along undercurrent. Strong leaders from within or at the top can have a significant impact on the corporate culture. Next slide. Corporate culture can be a sustaining value, offering direction and stability during challenging times. Or it can prevent a firm from responding to challenges in creative and timely ways because the corporate culture weighs heavily on them and prevents them from going forward. The stability a culture provides can be a benefit at one time and a barrier to success at another time. So the corporate culture can either help or hinder good ethical decision making. Some corporate cultures are defined from the top down, management meaning coming from the top down to the lower employees. Others are developed by employees themselves. Next slide. Defining the specific culture is not an easy task since it's particularly based on each employee's perception of the culture. Perception may actually impact culture in a circular way. In addition, culture is present in and can be determined by exploring any of the following among others. Tempo of work, the organization approach to humor. Humor is very, very important in work. Methods of problem solving, the competitive environment, incentives, individual autonomy, meaning the ability for individuals to do what they think needs to be done, given freedom to do their work. And hierarchical structure. Is it a tall structure? Are there many layers between each level of management? Or is it flat? Many people reporting to one person. And communication is more seamless. Figure 4.2. If you look there, see a woman looking away from a fishbowl. Culture. What culture? And the fish says water. What water? Even with this list of cultural elements, it can be difficult for an individual in a firm to identify the specific characteristics of the culture in which they work. People look at things differently. The same culture can be looked at one person as being excellent and by another person being a malignant culture. Ethics in corporate culture, a quote by Seneca. Our plans miscarry because they have no aim. When a person does not know what harbor he or she is making for, no wind is the right wind. Culture and ethics, continued. How does the notion of culture connect with ethics? What role does corporate culture play in business ethics? Maintaining an ethical advantage aids success. People want to be associated with an ethical company, whether it's a customer being associated with the company or the employees and other stakeholders. Legal limitations ensure ethical compliance. If you're not ethical, you're going to run afoul from the law. And when the law provides incomplete answers, the culture influences decisions to fill in the gaps in that gray area. Each of the factors in the decision-making model can be supported or discouraged by the culture. Key components to creating an effective culture: strong, focused leadership, being proactive rather than reactive, and creating habits that place stakeholders at the heart of the organization's mission as opposed to the rear. Culture and ethics continued. The cultivation of habits, including ethical virtue, is greatly shaped by the culture in which one lives. Where we get our habits and character is all important. We can choose to develop some habits. Habits are shaped by education and training by the culture that we live in. Intentionally or not, businesses provide an environment in which habits are formed and virtues or vices are created, just like they are at home. The effects of workplace culture on decision making cannot be overemphasized and can never be ignored. Culture and ethics continued. If attended to, a strong ethical culture can deter stakeholder damage and improve bottom line sustainability. If ignored, the culture could destroy long-term sustainability in both financial performance and employee retention. Because remember, nobody wants to be associated with a rogue organization. Responsibility for creating and sustaining ethical corporate cultures rests on business leaders. While true that individuals can shape an organization, it is equally true that organizations shape individuals. The person you become, your attitudes, values, expectations, mindset, and habits will be significantly determined by the culture of the organization in which you work. Compliance and value-based cultures. A distinction arose between two types of corporate cultures. Some firms were classified as compliance-based cultures, the traditional approach. We got to do whatever the law requires, we have to comply. While others were considered to be integrity-based or values-based culture. Clearly defined, value-based culture is a corporate culture in which conformity to a statement of values, a value statement, what we value, and principles rather than simply obedience to laws and regulations is the prevailing model for ethical behavior. A perfect example of this is the Johnson & Johnson Credo, created by Robert Woods Johnson back in the 1930s. And this is actually taught to all managers and employees at Johnson & Johnson via something called Johnson & Johnson University, which is an internal university that makes sure that all managers, all leaders understand the virtue and the need to follow the credo in all their decision making. Table 4.1 is the evolution of compliance programs into value-based programs. Traditional could be audit-focused, transaction-based, financial account-focused, compliance objectives, policies and procedures, etc. The progressive best practices, business-focused, process-based, customer-focused, risk identification, as you're looking for the risks before they turn into something bad, and process improvement objectives, etc., etc. You can look at figure 4.1 on your own for all the details. Compliance and values-based culture. Next slide. Compliance-based cultures rely on rules to enforce ethics. A values-based culture reinforces a set of values rather than rules. A compliance culture is only as strong and precise as the rules. When rules don't apply, a values-based culture relies on the personal integrity of its workforce. Compliance-oriented goals may include meeting legal and regulatory requirements, minimizing risks of litigation and indictment, and improving accountability mechanisms. The goals of a more evolved ethics program may entail maintaining brand and reputation, recruiting and retaining desirable workers, unifying a firm's global operation, creating a better working environment, and doing the right thing as well as doing things right. Machiavelli, not the most ethical guy on the planet. There is nothing more difficult to carry out, no more doubtful of success, no more dangerous to handle than to initiate a new order of things. Putting new things into place is definitely very, very difficult. Interesting coming from Machiavelli, who said the ends justify the means. How ironic. Ethical leadership in corporate culture. Next slide. Corporate leadership has a primary responsibility to steward corporate culture. Stakeholders are guided by the tone at the top. There must be a consistent tone throughout the firm. One 2013 study found that senior leaders are more likely than lower-level employees to break the rules, and as such, they send the wrong message to people below them. And 60% of reported misconduct is attributed to managers. If leadership acts unethically, stakeholders receive the message this type of behavior is acceptable and condoned. Alternatively, if a leader acts ethically, above any other consideration, stakeholders are guided by that role model. Beyond personal behavior, next slide. Beyond personal behavior, leadership sets the tone through other mechanisms. Budgeting is all about value, is a long-standing management credo. When ethics officers were first introduced in the early 90s, the extent of their financial support indicated their relevance and influence. Money talks, and that's how it was represented in the hiring of these people. Creating a shared company culture is a key responsibility. Leaders should be perceived as people-oriented, as well as engaging in visible ethical action. Executives who are quietly ethical are not perceived as ethical leaders. Ethics has to exude from you, it has to spill out from you. The impact of ethical leadership is significant. Next slide. Effective leadership and ethical effective leadership. How do the effective leader and the ethical effective leader differ? Not every effective leader is an ethical leader. You could be effective and get the job done, but not necessarily the most ethical way. One key difference is the means used to motivate others and achieve goals. You can motivate people like Joseph Stalin. Hey, if you don't get the project done, I will put you and your family into a Siberian gulag. That'll definitely get results, but it's definitely not a very ethical way of doing things, obviously. I know it's a very extreme case, but it's true. That's what he did to Russian scientists, to push them to create the best airplanes, the best hardware, the best munitions, etc., etc. Some believe it is the methods used in leading, correct methods that is. Servant leadership, being a servant to your employees, transformative or transactional. The other elements involve the end or or objective. In the business context, productivity, efficiency, and profitability are minimal goals for sustainability. But are ethical profitability and efficiency enough to make a leader an ethical leader? Beyond the goal of profits, other socially responsible goals might be necessary. It's not just getting the goal done and making money, it's how you make that money. Is it done correctly? Is it done honestly, ethically? Building a value-based corporate culture, next slide. Culture derives from leadership, integration, assessment, and monitoring. One of the key manifestations of ethical leadership is the articulation of values for the organization. Getting it out there, making sure people understand it. But do codes make a difference? Before impacting culture through a code of conduct or statement of values, a firm must determine its mission. You need to have the mission, which is basically who we are and what we do, and then you can move on to a code of conduct. The code has the potential to both enhance reputation and provide guidance for internal decision making, thus creating a built-in risk management system, an early warning system, if you will. Next slide, building a value-based culture, corporate culture continued. The mission should be inspiring. Establishing the core tenets, especially through a participatory process, lays down the law for all future decisions. The mission statement of Corporate Credo articulates the principles that should guide all decisions without abridgment. From a universalist perspective, many decisions might be made with the end in mind, but none should ever breach the underlying mission as an ultimate dictate. Developing the mission and code, next slide. It is critical to first ask what the company stands for. Why does the firm exist? What are its purposes? Second, develop guiding principles through a clear vision. The third step is to identify clear steps as to how this culture shift will occur. Finally, to have an effective code that will impact culture, there must be a belief that this culture is actually possible. If you don't believe in it, it'll never happen. While businesses have codes of conduct, industries and/or professions might also publish codes of conduct. Table 4.2, Ethics Code of Conduct. Be clear about the objectives the code is intended to accomplish. Get support and ideas for the code from all levels of the organization, not just from the top. Be aware of the latest developments in laws and regulations that affect your industry. Write as simply as clearly as possible. Not everybody's a scholar and will understand you. Avoid legal jargon and empty generalities which people won't understand or appreciate. Respond to real-life questions and situations. Make it real, make it relevant. Provide resources for further information and guidance in all of its forms. Make it user-friendly, because ultimately code falls if it is not used. So make it user-friendly, written in simple English. Make it usable for people. Cultural integration, next slide. Integration can take different forms depending on the organizational culture and the ultimate goals of the process. One of the most decisive elements of integration is the communication aspect. Effective integration processes have incentives in the right place to encourage ethical decision making. It is evaluated during a workers' performance review, so ethics is definitely hardwired into whether or not you get to stay, whether or not you get a raise, whether or not you get a promotion, etc. How does communication about ethical matters occur? Reporting ethically suspected behavior is a difficult thing to do, but it must be done. Nobody likes a tattletale, and those who report may be retaliated against. And that's why we have whistleblower laws when dealing with sexual harassment, for example, to protect those that do the right thing. Cultural integration, and I just let the cat out of the bag. Whistleblowing is a classic issue in business ethics. Whistleblowing is a practice in which an individual within an organization reports organizational wrongdoing to the public or to others in positions of authority so that they're aware of what's going on so that they can change things. Occurs internally and externally. Whistleblowing to external groups can be very, very harmful. It'll hurt the reputation of the organization, may lead to litigation, loss of money, etc. Internal mechanisms for reporting wrongdoings are preferable. Keep it in the family. Try to solve it from within. Next slide. Cultural integration continued. Internal reporting mechanisms must be effective because otherwise people will go to the external. They must allow confidentiality, if not anonymity. They must strive to protect the rights of the accused party. Many firms have created ethics ombudspersons, people who represent the ethics, and internal or external ethics hotlines to deal with these reports. Some firms use a speak up program rather than blowing the whistle, creates a positive image of reporting ethical issues. One challenge with the reporting system is that they do not make the values of the organization clear. What is or is not accepted within the company's culture, that should be spelled out in the corporate culture's value statements. Cultural integration continued. Methods for a successful reporting scheme. Leaders should model the act of reporting wrongdoing. Leaders can explain the decision-making process so that people understand how things work. Crisis management teams are often unsuccessful, but running drills or rehearsals of challenging events is a valuable exercise so people know how to do it. Allow sufficient time for reflection. Consistently and continuously communicate values and expectations to all stakeholders. Reinforce these values through the firm's compensation and reward structure. A firm must also consider the logistics of global implementation of its code of conduct and ethics programs. Assessing and monitoring the corporate culture. Next slide. Monitoring and an ongoing ethics audit allows the discovery of silent vulnerabilities which could pose later challenges. Got to find the little cracks in the wall before you have massive issues. How do you detect a toxic culture? A clear sign is a lack of values for the organization. Warning signs can occur in various areas of the organization. How to measure the impact of efforts to change a culture. Determine if perceptions have changed. External audits provide information as does hotline data. Any employee feedback should be gathered and analyzed for input regarding the culture. And so they have yearly satisfaction surveys in many organizations to be able to handle that. Mandating and enforcing culture. The United States Sentencing Commission, known as the USSC, an independent agency in the U.S. judiciary, regulates sentencing policy in the federal court system. The USSC prescribes mandatory federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, known as FSGOs, that apply to individuals and organizational defendants in the federal system. Listed 43 offense levels based on the severity of the offense. Each offender is categorized based on the extent and recency of past misconduct. The court inputs this information into a sentencing grid and determines the offender's sentence guidelines ranges. Figure 4.3, source of culture. Review culture derives from leadership, integration, and assessment monitoring. Leadership and maintenance of the control environment through high-level commitment and management responsibility and accountability. Leaders set the standard and the tone for what the culture is going to look like. Control activities, information and communication, statement policies, operating procedures, communications, and training. Constant, consistent integration into business practices. It can't be outside of the organization. It has to be hardwired into everyday operations. Review assessment, ongoing monitoring, evaluation, historical accountability as mentioned before. The USSC strives to use the guidelines to create both legal and ethical corporate environments. This effort was supported by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. For those of you accounting majors, you should recognize that. Further, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act required public companies to establish a code of conduct for top executives. Mandating and enforcing culture. Next slide. The guidelines encourage corporations to create or maintain effective ethics and compliance programs. Those companies with the documented programs may receive a mitigated penalty if any ethical issue is to arise because they put something into effect. Firms without effective ethics programs may receive additional probation and order to develop a program, called an aggravated penalty. The USSC notes that organizations shall exercise due diligence to prevent and detect criminal conduct. The guidelines identify specific acts an organization can use as due diligence and the minimal requirements for an effective compliance and ethics program. Continue, next slide, mandating and enforcing culture. The USSC minimum requirements, standards and procedures, responsibility of board and other execs, adequate resources and authority, get the job done, board oversight, don't just be on the paper, don't just be on the letterhead, be active, high-level personnel, regular reporting, preclusion from authority, prior misconduct, communication and training, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting process, incentive and disciplinary structures, enforcement consistently, not just once in a while, response and modification mechanisms, meaning you've got to respond and modify the situation. Mandating and enforcing culture. In 2010, the USSC lowered the penalties for compliance violations if the organization met the following 4 criteria. Those responsible for the programs must have direct reporting obligations to the governing authority. The program detected the offenses before outside discovery, so the internal mechanism worked. 3, the offense was promptly reported to governmental authorities, wasn't put under the rug. 4, no person responsible for the program condoned the offenses. So there was a due diligence, there was a great effort, there was a lot of trying and probing that happened. So as a result, you can't really give them, throw the book at them because they tried their best. The guidelines are flexible, allowing companies to tailor programs to their own use. That same flexibility allows reasonable minds to disagree on meanings of various aspects of the guidelines. Table 4.1, Part 1. Tradition compliance program is audit-focused, while the progressive or value-based program are business-focused. The traditional program is transaction-based, while the progressive program is process-based. The traditional program has a focus on financial accounting, while the progressive program is customer-focused. These are all things that we just went through in the slides. This is a bit of a review. The objective of the traditional program is compliance, while the objective of the progressive program is on risk identification and process improvement. Focus is on policies and procedures in the traditional focus and on risk management in the progressive programs. The traditional program depends on multi-year audit coverage, while the progressive program uses continual risk assessment coverage. Part 2. Traditional programs believe in policy adherence, while the progressive programs are change facilitators. They make things happen. Budgeted cost centers are used in traditional programs and accountability for performance improvement results in the progressive programs. Traditional programs use career auditors, while progressive programs have opportunities for other management positions. The methodology of the traditional program is to focus on policies, transactions, and compliance. The methodology of progressive programs is to focus on the goals, strategies, and risk management process. Continued. The Ethics Resource Center provides the following guidelines for writing an ethics code. Be clear about the objectives the code is intended to accomplish. Get support ideas for the code from all levels of the organization. You want everybody involved. Number 3, be aware of the latest developments in the laws and regulation that affect your industry. Number 4, write as simply and as clearly as possible. Avoid legal jargon and empty generalities. Number 5, respond to real-life questions and situations. Number 6, provide resources for further information and guidance. Number 7, in all of its forms, make it user-friendly, because ultimately code fails if not used. Continuation. Culture derives from leadership, integration, and assessment of monitoring, leadership, and maintenance of the control environment. Through high-level commitment and management responsibility, leaders set the standard and the tone. Control activities, information and communication, statements, policies, operating procedures, communications, and training are vital. Constant and consistent integration into business practices, making sure again that it's hardwired into internal workings, not something that is external, not applicable. Number 3, review, assessment, and ongoing monitoring. Monitoring, evaluation, historical accountability. Thank you and have a wonderful day. And thank you for listening to this lecture. Be well and good luck on your studies.